I feel a little bit like Admiral James Stockdale in the 1992 vice presidential debate. Some of you may be old enough to remember that, as he opened his remarks with two questions. Who am I, and why am I here? When people ask me how long I've lived in Michigan, I respond that I wasn't born here, but I got here as quickly as I could. Similarly, though I've always considered myself a conservative, in comparison to the august present company and members of other panels, I was not born or raised with Russell Kirk nor Roger Scruton, but I've been trying to catch up as fast as I can, and I still have a long way to go. In my remarks today, I want to tease out what seems to me an ongoing tension between various strands or emphases or streams of the conservative mind and temperament. And that's the seeming tension, however real or imagined, between the role of reason in thinking about and actually living a conservative and flourishing human life, and the roles of custom, convention, place, experience, history, and all that is passed down from our fathers and mothers, as we see in the etymological root of tradition, to pass on. So there are some things that conservatives clearly oppose: immanentizing the eschaton, utopian schemes meant to bring heaven on earth, whether a religious or a secular heaven. Conservatives also oppose a priori designs for perfecting human nature, as used by coffee house fanatics and metaphysical enthusiasts, to borrow language from Kirk, or to borrow from Scruton's language, reasoning from a set of axioms, as well as Scruton's robust suspicion of abstract ideas. The tension exists insofar as conservatives, including Kirk and Scruton, also clearly have a significant place for reason. One of Kirk's 6 canons, just mentioned, of conservative thought is belief in a transcendent order, which he refers to as natural law, something that helps us understand and apply justice. And when Kirk writes justice, it's with a capital J in his opening to the idea of conservatism. Kirk speaks of philosophical tenets and general principles to be distinguished from fanatic ideological dogma. Those principles are arrived at, he says, by convention and compromise, and tested by experience, which seems to me to speak more of how we come by them than what their ultimate source or ground is. Scruton, the accomplished philosopher, also has an important place for reason, rightly understood, describing the meaning of conservatism as aiming to find the concepts with which conservatives can provide themselves with a creed, adding to a later edition of that book an appendix in which he tries to show that there really is a philosophical basis for the doctrine I offer. Scruton also treats reason as being compatible, indeed necessitated, by our particular lives marked by tradition, place, and inheritance. He says near his opening of Conservatism, an invitation to the great tradition, that the principal contribution that conservatism has made to human self-understanding, which is a rather grand claim that he qualifies with a probably, is that while Aristotle is right that one aim of political life is to refine the use of reason and to implant in the citizen the virtues that are necessary for its collective exercise, we rational beings need customs and institutions that are founded in something other than reason if we are to use our reason to good effect, end quote. All that seems to me to be correct, but I admit to sometimes wondering about how we distinguish between what's abstract and what's concrete, what's metaphysical and what's politically prudential. While history and tradition and experience and the charming and not so charming idiosyncratic particulars and foibles of hearth, hamlet, home, and village provide us with the material by which we learn about ourselves, our world, and what good living is, by what capacity or tool or aspect of our nature do we tease out what is worth conserving and what is not? When we inherit and experience competing and incommensurable customs, conventions, and context, can we then rely on a second-order custom to adjudicate between them? Customs, conventions, and experience are perhaps a bit like piano keys. They themselves cannot determine how they should be played. We contemporary conservatives have the great benefit of inheriting the wisdom of thought of both Kirk and Scruton and others. But Scruton describes Hegel, for example, as a true conservative whose political philosophy evolved into the most systematic presentation that we have of the conservative vision of political order. Kirk, on the other hand, writes of Hegel and Burke that, quote, people who think that these two men represent different facets of the same system are in danger of confusing authoritarianism with conservatism, end quote. Not to be too cheeky, but the principle that we should reject abstract a priori metaphysical reasonings seems to me to be, well, a little abstract. Is that bit of wisdom applicable to all times and places? Is it salutary counsel that we can confidently apply across the board? I'm not sure how a conservative is to answer that. Let's consider the following claims. 1, human beings have inherent and equal dignity, having been created in the imago Dei. 2, there is a supreme being who is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent. 3, the human soul is immortal and destined for eternity. And 4, speaking of Kant, human beings should never be treated only as means, but also as ends in themselves. These all strike me as rather abstract claims about reality, and there is plenty of experience, history, and custom to throw doubt on their reliability as truth claims. Does our everyday experience indeed tell us that human beings are actually equal? Are we all dignified? George Orwell in 1984 severely, in my mind, undermines this view in the torture scene in 1984 with Winston and O'Brien. And the qualities of God taught by classical theism strike me as metaphysical abstractions par excellence, as does the notion of the immortality of the soul. And yet, many of us, perhaps many in this room, learned these ideas and doctrines from our father's knee and in our mother's milk, seconded by Sunday school lessons and children's stories and folk tales and ancient scriptures passed on to us from generations stretching back for more than 2,000 years. And if that describes you, as it does me, then we have inherited customs, conventions, and practices that themselves point beyond the merely customary, conventional, and practical. They point to truths that are universal in scope and even abstract, though they are passed on to us through who we are as embodied and in-place human beings in families and churches and the local. I'm reminded here of Leo Strauss's autobiographical meditation from his later preface to Spinoza's Critique of Religion, which he wrote 34 years after that book was published. Strauss describes his earlier self as a young Jew born and raised in Germany who finds himself in the grip of the theological political predicament. He writes about the peculiar place of German Jews who were given full citizenship for the first time by the weak and vulnerable Weimar regime. The paradox for German Jews was that they had opened themselves up to German ideas and German culture, and yet this culture's political and spiritual core was fused together in a virulent Christian anti-Semitism. Weimar Jews believed that their predicament had been solved by liberalism. They were German citizens who happened to be Jewish, entitled to the same rights and standing as any other Germans. When this belief was shattered by the rise of National Socialism, a significant number of Jews turned to political Zionism. Liberalism had failed them, both in the weakness of the Weimar Republic and those purportedly liberal countries which, by forcing the terms of Versailles, betrayed their own liberal principles and in so doing ensured the death of the Weimar Republic. Strauss points out that strictly political Zionism was too narrow. It missed the history, blood, and tradition of Jewish culture and thus needed to be incorporated into a more substantial cultural Zionism, if it were to be more than a short-term political answer to the horrifying failure of European liberalism. Yet the cult in cultural Zionism survived among some Jews even after the fall of Nazism. And Strauss wrote that even as a middle position, cultural Zionism cannot help but become theological. He writes this: one could not have taken this step unless one had previously interpreted the Jewish heritage itself as a culture, i.e. as a product of the national mind, of the national genius. Yet the foundation, the authoritative layer of the Jewish heritage presents itself not as a product of the human mind, but as a divine gift, as divine revelation. Did not one completely distort the meaning of the heritage to which one claimed to be loyal by interpreting it as a culture like any other high culture? The answer, it seems, is yes. One does distort the meaning of the heritage, at least in this instance, as Strauss continues. When cultural Zionism understands itself, it turns into religious Zionism. But when religious Zionism understands itself, it is in the first place Jewish faith, and only secondarily Zionism. Now, there's a very interesting rabbit hole I will mention here but not go down, insofar as we could discuss Strauss's characterization of faith as obedience, which connects to some of Scruton's ideas, and in contradistinction to the place of reason, the life of philosophy, as Strauss sees these two in utter tension, even as he says that tension is the source of the dynamism of the Western tradition. But instead of that rabbit hole, I'll close my meandering meditations with two thoughts that follow from the suggestion that the bright lines drawn between abstract and metaphysical principles on the one hand and customary and conventional prudential political principles on the other may be blurrier than they are made out to be. For we have in the conservative position, particularly from Kirk, an emphasis on both the place of a transcendent order as a natural law and the role of prudence. If we go back to my fourth abstraction, that human beings should never be used merely as means but also treated as ends, and we combined that with another moral principle, that human sexuality should not be treated like a commodity, like rice or skateboards or matcha coffees on the market, we arrive at the conclusion that prostitution is unjust. As I understand the conservative antipathy toward utopian schemes and abstraction, what would be objectionable here would be a universal scheme to enforce this principle in a one-size-fits-all straitjacket that ignores local realities, norms, and history, as well as competing and jostling principles about the size and scope of government. That is why I'm encouraged that Augustine and Aquinas, two champions of theological abstractions as well as the central role of reason, condemned prostitution morally, but objected to outlawing it legally because they judged that, given the lecherous state of the people in that time and place, such a prohibition would only increase lust and bad behavior. This sort of judgment suggests that the real problem isn't with abstract principles per se, that is, with the directional judgments that reason and revelation may lead us to, but with a radical disregard for the finite and fallen nature of human beings, which is yet another doctrine, such that coffeehouse fanatics think that we can make the world anew with a mere Thanos-like snap of our fingers. So the importance of prudence is my first point, which is not at all original, but as Scruton writes, not being original is the first requirement of conservative thought. The second thing I conclude with as only a hint of a question to wrestle with, and that's how Scruton and other conservatives' emphasis on obedience works when what we've inherited itself points to an authority far more universal, powerful, and demanding than anything as transitory as the nation state, as important as that might be temporally, as Scruton implies in many of his writings. For if the Christian teaching about the immortality of the soul that I and others have inherited through a lived tradition is true, then our true home and identity is found in the city of God, which Kirk mentions frequently. And our most fundamental ties are to our brothers and sisters in the faith, even if, as Jesus scandalously taught, those spiritual ties might outweigh our bonds to our natural family. If we are immortal, then to quote an Irish conservative, you have never met a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals with whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Whether that is a conservative claim, abstract or concrete, true or false, I'll leave now as an open question.